Hello friends, I am Dr. Abida Farooqui, Assistant Professor of English, Govt Arts and Science College, Kondotty. The topic of my lecture today is Plato and Aristotle, the seminal thinkers. The lecture is divided into two parts. In the first part, I'll be talking about the major ideas of Plato as elucidated in his Republic and his formulations on poetic art. And in the second part, I'll be talking about Aristotle. The word criticism derives from the Greek word krites, meaning to judge. When you take this in a broad sense, literary criticism began in archaic Greece around 800 years before the birth of Christ. This was the period of the great epics, the period of Homer and Hesiod, and the period of the lyric poets Sappho and Archilochus. What we call the classical period is, or it happened in 500 BC, that is the period of the great dramatists like Euripides, Aeschylus and Sophocles, and the great classical philosophers like Socrates, Plato and Aristotle. The classical period was followed by the Hellenistic period, which saw the diffusion of Greek culture into the Mediterranean, which was accelerated by the conquest of Alexander, and after his death there were succeeding invasions by his generals. And the Hellenistic period ended with the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, when the Romans took over the entire area that was under Greek domination, and Julius Caesar's nephew Octavian became the ruler or the monarch of the entire Roman area or kingdom, and he came to be known as Augustus. During the span of almost 1,000 years, poets, philosophers, rhetoricians, grammarians and critics laid down a few concepts that were to shape the future of literary criticism as it evolved till our own day. Some of these concepts are the concept of mimesis or imitation, the concept of beauty and its connection with truth and goodness, the ideal of the organic unity of a work of art, the social, political and moral functions of literature, the connection between literature, philosophy and rhetoric, the nature and status of language, the impact of literary performance on an audience, the definition of figures of speech like metaphor, metonymy and symbol, the notion of a canon of great literary works, and many other concepts were evolved during this particular period. And during this period, pure aesthetic approach to art was alien. Poetry had an educational function, and its ramifications extended over religion, morality and the sphere of civic responsibility. Now, poetry was a forum for the discussion of larger issues, and its relevance lied both in its public and political function as well as in its artistic and technical perfection. If we talk about the pre-classical philosophers, that is the philosophers who lived before Socrates, like Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, they were natural philosophers, and they were called natural philosophers because of their preoccupation with natural processes or natural things. They discussed problems like what is the earth made of, what is water made of, and so on. When you come to the classical philosophers, there was a big shift from these natural phenomena to problems concerning man, the mind of man, virtue, morality, honor, patriotism and so on. And this was the period of Socrates, Aristotle and Plato, rightly called or defined as the classical period. There are a number of intellectual currents that formed the background of the period, this classical period. Two important ones were the sophistic and the rhetoric. Sophists were itinerant philosophers who lived during the time of Plato, and two important sophists were Gorgias and Protagoras. And rhetoric was the art of public speaking. Rhetoric was vital to the functioning of Athenian democracy. Now both sophists and rhetoricians, they charged high fee, and their curriculum was designed in such a way as to bring people into public life. Plato was opposed to both the sophistic and the rhetoric. He was opposed to sophists because they were secular, humanistic and relativistic. Their accounts rejected the authority of religion, and they viewed truth as a human construct. In other words, there was no truth outside human perception, and this was something that was not acceptable to Plato. Regarding rhetoric, his disagreement was that rhetoric is the art of persuasion. So it does not deal with truth, but it is basically panders to emotions, prejudices and biases, and it preys upon the ignorance of the audience, and it does not have a moral or objective foundation. And Plato's philosophy is generated by a desire to impose order on chaos and to ground our thinking about morality, politics and religion on timeless and universal truths. He followed a dialectic method, that is a method where you have questions and answers, and his work comprises 35 dialogues and 13 letters. During Plato's time, poetry had a public function. It had a role similar to the media or religious institutions, educational institutions and so on of our own period. And he rejects the morally incoherent vision of the universe that was disordered, irregular, chaotic and unpredictable. If we talk about the poetry, in poetry anything is possible. Gods quarrel with each other. You have the Greek god Zeus quarreling with his wife Athena, or quarreling with his wife Hera, or you have the quarrel between goddesses like Athena and Aphrodite, and poetry talks about the indecorous conduct of gods. This is a world that is ruled by chance, where gods can interfere or they can manipulate with whatever they wanted to do. Plato's ideas were actually indebted to the pre-Socratic tradition of the pre-Socratic tradition of naturalism, and that was not poetic or mythical, and that was grounded on the basis of reason. Moreover, like the naturalists, Plato and Socrates distinguished between the evidence of the senses. What we feel or experience through the senses are illusory, and reality lies somewhere outside, and this reality can be accessed only through reason. Hence, Greek philosophy begins with the application of rational thinking to all areas of human life. It is widely acknowledged that Plato laid the foundations of Western philosophy. The mathematician and philosopher A.N. Whitehead said that entire Western philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato. The American thinker Emerson said, Plato is philosophy and philosophy Plato. Plato was born in 428 BC in Athens in an aristocratic family. At the age of 20, he fell under the spell of the great philosopher Socrates. He gave up his political ambitions and he devoted his life to the study of philosophy. In a story that you find in Plato's Apology, Socrates has been hailed by the oracle at Delphi as the wisest man alive. And Plato uses a dialectical method of question and answer. So he would arouse hostility in the listeners by deflating their pretensions of what they knew. For example, he would ask a person what is justice, and that person would give his definition, and Socrates would keep on arguing and prove that that person's understanding of justice was wrong. So Socrates was highly unpopular. He was unpopular because he undermined the conventional views of goodness and justice, and he was also unpopular because he did not support democracy. That is why he was eventually poisoned to death in 399 BC. After the death of his revered master, Plato left Athens at the age of 28, and he wandered in many places like Italy, Sicily, and even in Egypt, and he came back at the age of 40 in order to found his academy in Athens. There is an inscription at the entrance of academy, and it reads, "Let no one without geometry enter here." Geometry was the foremost in the curriculum along with mathematics and philosophy. Plato's thought was influenced by a number of pre-Socratic philosophers who rejected the physical world that is known through our senses. And which is mere appearance. So there was a reality behind physical phenomena. Some of these philosophers were Heraclitus, who said that all things in the universe are subject to change. Parmenides was another philosopher who said that the real or reality is unchanging. Plato was also influenced by the timeless mathematical concepts formulated by Pythagoras. According to Plato, the world of forms is changeless and eternal, and that is reality. It is a world of essences, it is a world of unity and universality. Whereas the physical world that is known through our senses is a world of mere existence. And it is a world of multiplicity as opposed to unity, and a world. According to Plato, the world of forms is changeless and eternal, and that constitutes reality. It is the world of essences, unity, and universality as opposed to the physical world, which is characterized by existence and multiplicity as well as particularity. Plato brings in the idea of the myth of the cave in his work. The myth of the cave is a cave where you have some people, they are turning their faces at the opposite direction. There is the entrance is at the back. It is a subterranean cavern, and beyond that there is a low wall, and beyond that there is a burning fire or light. Now when people walk behind the wall, what these people see is that they see only shadows because they are not able to turn around and look at them. Their face, their hands and legs are all fettered. So these people who have never seen reality, they take these shadows for reality. Whereas in order to comprehend reality, they have to break their fetters and turn around so that they can see the real shape and size of the persons walking. Plato's point is that people who have known only these shadows will take them for reality. So they have to actually stand up, break these fetters and access reality. Accessing this reality is possible by applying your reason. So Plato makes it clear that the cave in which these people are sitting represents the physical world, whereas the light beyond is the journey towards that light is actually the soul's accession to the world of reality or the world of forms. And Plato makes many comments on poetry in his dialogues. In his apology, he affirms that poetry derives from inspiration rather than from wisdom, and hence poetry is unreliable. In another work, Ion, he says, "The poet is a light and winged thing and holy, and never able to compose until he has become inspired, and is beside himself, and reason is no longer in him." So Plato sharply divided the provinces of poetry and philosophy. Poetry is, or it has as its basis, a divorce from reason. Reason is the realm of philosophy. So poetry is steeped in emotions and lack of self-possession. Now Plato's text has actually inspired many defenses of poetry. The most important ones are the work of Sidney, the Renaissance critic Sidney, and also the Romantic critic Percy Bysshe Shelley. Plato establishes an intimate connection between his idea of aesthetic and his formulation of justice. And his idea of poetry and his idea of justice they stand in opposition to each other. Socrates argues that poetry has failed to examine justice in itself because the world of the poet is confined to the world of appearance. There is a character called Adimantus in the Republic who says that what is popularly considered praiseworthy is not justice, and people do not like justice for its own sake but for the reputation arising from it. Laymen and poets acknowledge sobriety and righteousness as honorable, but it is not pleasant, whereas injustice and licentiousness are in themselves dishonorable, but they are pleasant, which means that man has an innate propensity to do injustice. At the same time, they hold that injustice is more profitable than justice. They portray that gods assign misfortunes to good men, and it is very easy to propitiate gods by sacrifices or enchantments. So this vision of poetry is actually morally incoherent and hence unacceptable to Plato. And for all this, he cites poets as witnesses. Poetry, says Adimantus, teaches young men that appearance masters reality and that what is seeming is more profitable than what is just. Hence, poetic wisdom is morally incoherent. In the Republic, there is a conversation between Socrates and Glaucon. They talk about three classes of goods. There is one class of good that we like for its own sake and not for its result. For example, harmless pleasures and enjoyments. Another class of goods which we like for its own sake as well as for its results. For example, knowledge, health, and so on. There is a third class of goods which we like not for its own sake but for its results. For example, caring for the sick. In itself it is unpleasant, but its result is good. And he asks, where do you place justice? And the answer is that justice is in the highest class because it is good for its own sake as well as for its result. But Glaucon presents the views of Thrasymachus, a sophist, on justice. Glaucon says that men who practice justice do it against their will, and the life of the unjust is better than those of the just. And the answer is that to do injustice is good, but to suffer injustice is bad. I have a tendency to steal your pen, but I don't want you to steal my pen. So we mutually decide, or through mutual laws and covenants, we decide that we will not do that to each other. So it is a mean or a compromise. So the basic question is justice done out of instinct? And Plato brings in the story of a shepherd and how he comes across a magical ring, and how he tries to talk about how this the idea of injustice, or that propensity to do injustice, is inherent in man. A shepherd called Jacques was walking, and he sees a subterranean opening into the underground. He walks down and he sees the body of a dead man. On the body of a dead man there is a ring. He takes that ring, wears it, and he comes back and sits with his friends. As he turns the collet of his ring, he realizes that at one point he has become invisible. And after some time, when he turns it to the other side, he becomes visible. When he confirms this, the first thing that he does is that he goes to the palace, he seduces the queen, he kills the king, and he becomes the king. Now the question is, if such a ring is given to both a just man and an unjust man, how will they react? And Plato's answer is that they will react the same. They might act the same. And if a person who gets this ring and he does not do injustice will be looked upon as foolish, which means that we do injustice because we do justice only because we are forced to. Perhaps because of the reputation arising from it, or perhaps we fear society, or perhaps we fear God. So injustice is more profitable than justice. Parents advise children to be just only for the sake of reputation. So this is now Plato presents his arguments in a deductive fashion. Unlike Aristotle, Plato was not an empiricist. So he argues that if justice is good for the larger community, then it will be good for the individual also. So he goes from the larger to the smaller. How does a person check eyesight? First you read the larger letters and then you narrow down, you come down to the smaller letters. Similarly, he argues for the importance of justice for a community, and then he narrows it down and he argues how justice is important to the individual, though he might personally have other inclinations. In Plato's idea of an ideal state, no one is independent. Each person specializes in a particular job, and he does his allotted work perfectly well, and that is done for the common good. The basic needs of any individual is food, followed by clothing, and then by dwelling. And later you have other needs, like for example you need a shoemaker, you need a builder, you need a husbandman. And as the nation expands, as you have import and exports, you also need merchants and sailors. The state also requires guardians in order to rule effectively. These guardians are given the longest training, the longest educational training. A child is taken to school and given 10 years of training. Those who pass those 10 years go into the next stage. Those who pass the next 10 years or 20 years of training, they go into the third stage. And those who have completed 30 years of training are fit to be rulers or guardians. Rulers or guardians must be taught music as well as gymnastics. Music softens the soul. Too much of music is harmful. Gymnastics leads to a harsh disposition. Too much of gymnastics is bad. So you need the right combination of music and gymnastics given in the right measure for the development of a harmonious individual. Guardians are also taught arithmetic, astronomy, and geometry. All the three function on the basis of universal laws. Regarding literature, Plato's view is that literature is not harmful, but some kind of literature is harmful. So nurses must be taught to tell only authorized stories. All kinds of stories must not be taught to children because children cannot distinguish between what is allegorical and what is literal. In Homer, you find the son of God, Achilles, raving, ranting, taking sooty ashes, then going into a frenzy. All these are undignified depictions of God. And this might have a corrupting influence on the child, so children must not be taught this kind of literature. The ideal state values truth, and nobody should lie. Only rulers can lie, that too for the sake of the common good. And poets are liars. They tell lies, and so they must be banished from the republic. Plato advocated strict censorship of poetry. He was angry at the falsity of claims and the false representation of gods made by poets. It had a corruptive effect on character. So Plato said that poetry appeals to the inferior part of the soul, the appetitive portion, and it encourages variety and multiplicity. This distracts you from the contemplation of the universal or the real. And in Plato's idea, individuals are not self-sufficient. Each individual has to do his share of job. So there is an absolute division of labor in his republic. And you have a society of just men fulfilling their appropriate function. Now, what is poetry's crime? Poetry's crime is its insubordination in respect to specialization of labor. According to Plato's theory, each person must do only one job. Poetry imitates manifold forms, and that is ill-suited to his ideal polity. Unity is order, multiplicity is disorder or chaos, and there is only one truth. Plato indicts poetry because of its intrinsic expression of falsehood, because it is twice removed from reality, because of its multiplicity, and because of its appeal to emotion or the appetitive part of the soul. So his argument is that those poets who deal with falsehood must be banished. Another interesting argument that Plato puts forward is that philosophers must be kings. So it is the kings who must be the most educated. Education for Plato begins on a clean slate. And he argues that for any vocation you need training. In order to be a physician, in order to be a teacher, you need training. So why not for rulers? And rulers are given such a big job of ruling the nation, so they must be given the longest amount of training. Like man, like state. We can have good states only if we have good men. So the refinement of the individual is the basic purpose of education. Desire has its seat in the loins, emotion has its seat in the heart, and knowledge in the head. You need a harmonious balance of all these. And by teaching music as well as gymnastics in the right measure, a firm physical as well as physiological base is set. And each stage, as I told you earlier, after the first 10 years, those who do not pass the first 10 years, they are eliminated and they are supposed to do the economic work. They become businessmen, clerks, factory owners and so on. Those who move on to the next stage, that is the next 10 years, but fail to reach the third stage, they become auxiliaries or military officers. Those who complete the training, they become kings. And kings are taught philosophy. Metaphysics, they are taught metaphysics in order to think wisely, and they are taught politics in order to rule wisely. Plato also makes an interesting analogy of human beings to metals. Human beings are different like metals. You have people made of gold, silver and brass. Now, Plato does not believe that believe in heredity. He says that a golden parent may beget a silver son. So it is finally your aptitude and your talent that decides who you are. Plato also espoused an idea of communism. He believed that kings must not have private property. The state provides for them so that they dedicate their lives for the welfare of the polity or for the welfare of the common people. Plato also believed in gender equality. He believed that if women are given opportunities, they too can perform. So his idea is that the same kind of education should be given to men and women, and those who excel, they move from one stage to the other. So Plato had an egalitarian idea of society, unlike his disciple Aristotle. So to conclude, in his republic, justice prevails. Rulers are guided by reason. Each individual performs his duties in accordance with his aptitude and training, and all of them work for the well-being of the common people, and that is his idea of republic. Thank you all.